Hi, this is Jason Salemi. I'm an associate professor of epidemiology at the University of South Florida College of Public Health. And today I'm going to try and address a series of requests that I have received, basically saying if I don't have some fancy spreadsheet, but I am looking at the statewide and county level reports on a daily basis, please help me to understand how in the world are you getting your numbers to calculate the different positivity measures that people tend to be focusing on? How do you determine new versus repeat persons tested? And in your last video, you discussed 6 different subtypes of people who are tested. You know, the new positives, the new negatives, the repeat people who were negative but are now positive, and so on. How do you calculate all of these things? Again, not in a fancy, I don't want to see algorithms in a spreadsheet. I want to know where are you getting the numbers from and how are you making these determinations. So this is not necessarily right or wrong. This is how I do things. And as always, I invite feedback on this. So we'll discuss those different positivity measures, where to get the numbers from, how to calculate them. A little bit easier, how to determine new versus repeat persons tested, and how to assess the different types of people tested on each day. And so the first thing is going to be how to calculate the 4 case or test positivity measures on your own. And you'll see in all of these slides, it'll say using aggregated data. And that's, because Florida Department of Health is only providing information on Florida residents for a lot of these measures. So to be consistent, I'm going to show you how to calculate all of these for Florida residents only. So what you will need is a calculator or an electronic spreadsheet. I think just a computer-based calculator or a calculator on your phone, because you will have to perform some manual calculations ultimately to do this, which is why, again, in the long term, it makes sense to develop some sort of spreadsheet that is doing these calculations for you once you enter in a formula. You'll need the daily statewide report that's provided by the Florida Department of Health. If you look at their reporting archive, this is what it looks like for yesterday's report. And this is just what the first page of that report looks like. Should not be foreign to many people. A lot of eyes on this report. And the other one that you will need is the daily county level report. And again, that's also in the same archive. And this is what the first page of that report looks like. So those are the 3 main things that I think you'll need to be able to perform all of these calculations. And again, the big disclaimer is, I know that for some of these measures, you can actually calculate among all people. I'm not trying to remove the non-residents. I'm not trying to say they're not important, but for consistency's sake, because there are a couple of these measures, because of the data that are provided, you can only calculate them for Florida residents. In order to ultimately compare these positivity measures, I wanted to compare apples to apples. So everything that I'm going to demonstrate is going to be among Florida residents only. The first measure is not something that's daily, but it is something that people look at, and that is just the overall percent positivity. Really easy. It's just, since the beginning, since we started tracking these numbers, what proportion of people have tested positive among those tested. And so, again, simple. The numerator is people who have ever tested positive. The denominator is people who have ever received a positive or a negative test result. So notice I didn't say the denominator is all people ever tested. And that's because there is a very, very, very small proportion who have either pending or inconclusive results. I do not include them in the denominator. So basically, again, the denominator, who we are considering, is anybody who has ever received a positive or a negative test result, and the numerator is the proportion of those people, or the number of those people who have actually tested positive at some point. Where you get this from is the statewide report. This is on page 1. The numerator comes right from here under the Florida residents column, the number that have tested positive at any point in time. The denominator comes from adding both the positive and the negative test results under the Florida residents column. And then, of course, the percent positivity is pretty straightforward after that. It's the numerator divided by the denominator. And in this case, that overall percent positivity is 13.48%. And it should not be surprising to you that that number is already provided under the Florida residents column. But again, if you were just wondering how that is calculated, these are the numbers that go into that. So that's certainly the easiest one. And again, this one, it's tough, because if you monitor it on a day-to-day basis, if we had 80% of people tested tomorrow who tested positive, it might only result in a small increase in the overall positivity measure. So again, this is something that, yes, you can keep track of, but it's certainly going to dilute any day-to-day changes. Okay. Measure number 2 is one of the 2 measures that is reported daily by the Florida Department of Health, and that is the percent with positive test results. This is how they refer to this measure. I refer to it as the case positivity. The numerator is the people who tested positive today. The denominator is people who received a positive or negative test result today. So very similar to the overall positivity, but it's specific to the current day. This is where you're going to get that information on. Usually this is on page 2 of the statewide report. The numerator is going to come from down here. This is the total number of people who tested positive today, 5,313. The denominator comes from just above in the section, 61,686. You could have also just added from this bottom section the number testing positive and the number testing negative. It's a little bit easier to just get the automatically calculated number. Percent positivity, again, is really easy from there. It's the numerator divided by the denominator. And in this case, that's 8.61%. And again, this is already provided on the report, but here are the numbers behind how that is generated. I'll just say, if you've watched any of the videos before this, you'll know that this number, again, it's the total people who are tested on this day. This includes people who are tested for the first time, as well as people who have been tested on a previous day. So just keep that in mind. Measure number 3. This is also another measure that is reported daily by the Florida Department of Health. They term this the percent positivity for new cases. I'm just going to head forward here and just say the numerator and denominator are the exact same as the previous calculation that we just did. The big difference is we're going to exclude anyone who is tested positive on a previous day. And so where do I get the numbers for this? Now we're going to jump to the county, the daily county level report. So the first page of that county report shows you the number of cases. These are new cases, so this is people who have never tested positive on a previous day, but who have tested positive today. This is also from the county level report. This is on page 2, and it's a newer bar chart that they're giving you, and ultimately it's the number of people that they're classifying as testing negative today. But again, they're excluding those people who tested negative today, but tested positive on a previous day. So the numerator is that number. The denominator is, of course, the total people who were tested who never tested positive. That's the 2,957 plus the 50,593. And so then you just divide numerator by denominator, and you get the 5.52% rate that the Florida Department of Health also reports in a section just below this, right? So again, pretty straightforward, but this is where the numbers come from. And measure number 4, this is one that might be a little bit less frequently used, but I certainly see it all over the place. It's not really a percentage or a proportion, because for a true proportion, everybody who's in the numerator is also in the denominator. This is not the case here, so this is actually a ratio, the ratio of new cases or new positive test results to new people tested. So again, the numerator is people who tested positive for the first time today. The denominator is people tested for the first time today, receiving a positive or negative. So this is going to be where you're going to look. So in this case, the numerator is going to come from the county report. We just looked at this. The denominator is a little bit more complicated. So yes, you're going to look at the statewide report, and we saw this section on the first calculation that we did, but you're not only going to look at it for today, you're going to look at that same section from yesterday, because we're going to do a little bit of subtraction. So again, the numerator is pretty easy, the number of new people tested positive for the first time. The denominator is going to basically be, if I were to add up all of the positive and negative test results, or people tested with a positive or a negative today, minus that same number from yesterday. So that's what's happening here in the math. So the ratio ends up becoming 2957 divided by this math played out, which is 26,815. That's the number of people tested for the first time today. And so again, since it's a ratio, I would say this is 0.1103, but since all of the other positivity measures are expressed as a percentage, I don't think it's too misleading to also present this one as a percentage, so that would be 11.03%. But again, just keep in mind that this is a ratio and it's not a proportion, and we'll get into that into some of the next slides. So this is what we're left with. So if we're ending out with the different positivity measures, that are most frequently looked at, overall positivity, percent with positive test results or the case positivity, the percent positivity for new cases, and the new cases to new tested ratio, you can just see that we have different numbers, right? And this is part of the take home. I've mentioned in previous videos that many of these will trend together over time. So they'll give you maybe not the overall positivity rate because it's so, it dilutes so much the newer test results on a given day, but certainly the bottom three tend to trend together. So they'll give you a good feel for, are we increasing, decreasing, or staying the same? But obviously, as you can see, the absolute numbers are quite different. So now, how do you estimate new versus repeat people tested? I tend to tweet this out a lot, as do a lot of other people. It's important, right? We don't just want to know if we have 100,000 people who are tested today. It's very different if 90,000 of those 100,000 were people who had never been tested before, or if only 40,000 of 100,000 were new people never tested before. So again, I not only like to track how many people are tested on a given day, but what proportion of those people are new versus people who had been tested on a previous day. So you're going to need the same information basically as we needed to calculate the case positivity rates. So the first one is total people tested. Okay, how do we get that? Well, pretty straightforward. This is a number that comes from the statewide report on page 2, and it already gives you the number of Florida residents tested per day. So again, that's super easy, 61,686. The one thing that I do want to mention now, so you'll see some bars that I've put down here at the bottom. These are the same bars, so I've lined them up, right, so that the dates are the same, from the previous day's report. And so the only thing I want you to notice is if we compared on a given day the previous day's report to the current day's report, not always, but more often than not, you're going to see a difference in the numbers, right? So these numbers tend to change over time, right? And that's because, we're finding duplicates on a daily basis. We might be assigning resident to non-resident status or vice versa. So again, these numbers, they're not going to change dramatically, at least if history serves me well on that educated guess. They're going to change very minor relative to the total number of people that they're reporting. But again, they do change. It does not stay consistent. Okay, so let's get under the numbers of all of this. If I was going to look at the people tested today, right, I can take that from today's report. This is something very similar to what we just did for one of the case positivity measures, right? I can take the total number of positives plus the total number of negatives, and that is the total number of persons who have been tested based on today's report cumulatively to date, right? If I took the same data, so there's numerator and denominator, if I took the same data from people tested yesterday, and again, there's my numerator and my denominator, and I subtracted these two cumulative numbers, I would get the total new people tested today, right? Because each of these reports is showing me cumulatively, up until the date of the report, how many people have been tested. So if I just subtract those two, I can get a good estimate of the new people tested today. Not positive, not negative, it's just new people tested today. So by some simple subtraction from the number that we got on the previous slide of total people tested today, We subtract the new people tested today, and we're left with the repeat people tested. So people who were tested today, but that had been tested on a previous day, right? And usually we'll assign then a percentage to that and say 56.5% of all people tested today were repeat tests. Hopefully that makes sense. And again, this is where that number came from. So just keep in mind, this is from the actual report from today, the total number of people tested. Okay. You know, this approach to identifying new and repeat measures, it's not perfect. And again, this has to do more with the data updates that are done on a daily basis. So I just wanted to be clear about that. So if I were to have used this methodology, the same methodology of using today's report and yesterday's report and doing some subtraction to get the total number of new cases today or new people testing positive, this is how I would have done it, right? I would just take the total number of positive people from today's report minus the total number of positive people from yesterday's report, and I would have gotten 3,004. But if I would just go to the county level report and looked at the total number of new positives today, I would have gotten 2,957. So again, it's not perfect, but it's very close. And again, most of this has to do with the data updates that are going on a daily basis and the fact that these numbers change a little bit over time. Whereas when we're doing these calculations based on today and yesterday's report, which is necessary because we don't get enough granular data on each PDF, when we're kind of do this subtraction, we're going to end up with a number that is going to be extremely close, but not identical because of all these data updates. So again, hopefully that makes sense that, it's close enough, certainly. And so again, that's how I'm just going backwards. That's how we're estimating new versus repeat tests, right? But now how do we try and break it down even further and estimate the 6 testing subtypes? And these are those subtypes. So again, I think about when we receive a person who is tested today, what are the possible historical details about them? So again, if you've watched a previous video, you will know these. If you have not, you will not. So I can have a positive or a negative test result today. But these are the different things that could have led up to that. So a new positive is a person who's never been tested before today, and they test positive today. A new negative is a person who tested negative today and has never been tested before. A repeat positive to positive is somebody that prior to today we would have classified as positive, which means they had a positive test result in their history and today they test positive. The repeat positive to negative is again somebody who in their history prior till today had tested positive, but today they test negative. The repeat negative to positive is somebody that in their history only has negative test results. It could have been 1 previous negative, it could have been 100 previous negatives, but they only have negatives in their history. Today they tested positive. And last but not least, the repeat negative to negative is somebody who has only had negative test results in their history prior until today, and then today they also test negative again. So hopefully that makes sense on the 6 different types that we're trying to dig under the, get under the hood of. So I'm going to go from most to least accurate or specific data. So basically what I mean by that is I'm going to start with the subtypes for which I think I can get very accurate data based on what's provided to us. And at the top, you're going to notice that I'm going to keep kind of that running track of, keep in your mind, here's the total number of people tested today, here's the new people tested today based on our calculations, and here are the repeat people tested today. So first, I'm actually going to start with the repeat positive to negative. So again, this is a person who had tested positive at some point prior till today. So we would have classified them as a positive, and today they happen to test negative. So I'm going to remind you, right, this is why I'm bringing up that measure. When I gave you all of the calculations for the percent positivity for new cases, I emphasized this excludes anyone testing positive on a previous day, right? Who is this? These are people who tested positive on a previous day, so it's going to be relevant. So let's go back to how this is calculated, right? I'm going to take the total negative minus the people who are negative, right? and never positive. So that's not going to make much sense right now, but hopefully it will. So I'm going to look at two different sections of the statewide report, right? These are those two sections. And what I'm going to pull is this, because remember, we're trying to classify people who tested negative today. That's what this latter half of the positive to negative, right? It's people who tested negative today. So the total number of negative people tested, right, today, total number of negative tests is 56,373. And again, I pull that from the statewide report, which tells us here are the Florida residents who tested negative today. And I'm going to subtract from that. This bottom one is from the county report. And the Florida Department of Health is already kind of telling us, if you look at the footnotes here, they're saying these are people who tested negative today who have never tested positive before, right? So they're telling us that. So that's the total negative here. The negatives who were never positives is here. And so this number, if we just subtract these two, right? 5780. That is the number of people who had tested positive on a previous day and who tested negative today. So again, I have a lot of confidence in this number because it's provided to us in a very granular format by the Florida Department of Health's reports. Okay? And again, a reminder, these are people who would have been excluded from that percent positivity for new cases, who had tested negative today, but they were previously positive. So with that same argument, I'm now going to focus on the repeat positive to positive. So again, people we would have classified as positive who test positive again today. So to get this number, I'm going to take the total number of people who tested positive today minus the people who tested positive today but who were never positive before. So again, I'm going to use a combination of the statewide report, this is at the top, and the county level report, which is at the bottom. Here's the total number of people who tested positive. Here's the total number of people who tested positive today and who had never tested positive before, right? These are the new cases, so to speak. And what that leaves me with is 2,356 people who tested positive today and who had also tested positive on a previous day. So again, we're just trying to understand the different types of people who are testing depending on their results today in combination with what happened in the past. And so again, I have a high degree of confidence to say there were 2,356 people who tested positive today who had also tested positive on a previous day. And again, these are people who are excluded from that percent positivity for new cases number. Okay, what about new positives, right? So people who tested positive today who have never been tested before. You would think it's just as simple as looking at that. This is from the county report and just saying, well, here are new cases, right? This is what the Florida Department of Health will say. This 2,957, these are people who tested positive today who had never tested positive before. So isn't that just the new positives? No, it's not, right? These are first-time positives, yes, but not necessarily positives who have never been tested before. That number is actually a mix of two different numbers. What we'd like to know in this, right, the newly tested, first-time tested, and they got a positive today, right? That would be a new person tested. But it's also a combination of people who had always tested negative but now test positive. These are also new positive tests and are included in that number. So this number is actually a repeat of new people tested and repeat people tested. So again, this is now going to be, this number represents these two groups, the new positives and the people who were negative before, so they've been tested before, and now they test positive for the first time. Unfortunately, I cannot distinguish between these two. I can't say what proportion of this 2,957 were new positives versus the formerly negative but are now positives today. And in the same light, I cannot distinguish between the new negatives and the repeat negative to negative. So people who have never been tested before and test negative today versus the people who have tested negative many times or one time in the past and test negative today. I cannot distinguish between these two, but how is the math done to at least say how many people fall into one of these two groups? Again, this is just showing you that it's a mix. And so I'm going to take the total people tested today, right, minus those groups that basically we've already calculated the numbers for. So I'm going to subtract the repeat positive to negatives. I'm going to subtract the repeat positive to positives, and I'm going to subtract the ones that we just did, the new positives combined with the repeat negative to positive. So again, basically just taking the total people tested minus all of the groups for which we've done calculations, and I will end up with 50,593 people tested today who fall into one of these two groups that are indicative of people who got a negative test result today. So this is, again, to the best of my ability. I hope somebody, I might be missing something very easy. I hope somebody has a better way of coming up with this and maybe getting better estimates, but I can break down all people tested today into these groups. So here's how the numbers lay out. And then I can also give good estimates for, again, the total people tested is easy. They provide that. But I can also say this is the new people tested and the repeat people tested. The second to the last slide is, what if we tried to distinguish group 1 versus group 5 and group 2 versus group 6? How might one do that crudely? Well, I know how many repeat people were tested today, right? I also can subtract the ones that we know from the repeat group, right? So the repeat positive to negative, the repeat positive to positive, and I can say these are, if I were going to try and take these last four groups, right, and assign them, this is the number of repeat people tested that I would have to assign. And then I also have the number of new people tested to assign. And so what I want you to notice is these two groups are almost identical on today's date, right? They're about a 50-50 mix of what's left. So I could assume, this is a little dense, but I could assume that the new to repeat ratio in distinguishing between groups 1 and 5, because it's a mix of new and repeat tests, and in distinguishing between new and repeats in groups 2 and group 6, is the same as the ratio of the new and repeat people who are left to assign. So basically a 50-50. But this is most likely not true, right? The likelihood of a new positive versus a repeat positive when you've only tested negative, like these proportions are likely not to lay out identical. But again, if somebody wanted to crudely say that, they could take the number that we came up with for this group and basically say it's a 50-50 split. And the same thing here, it's a 50-50 split. I don't think that that's negative to get to that level of specificity. It'd be nice if we could, but I think it's not necessary, and I think it's a faulty assumption to think that those ratios are going to align well. And so at the end of all of this mumbo jumbo, right, I'm hoping that for people who have asked, this at least tells you where the numbers come from and how these things are calculated. But it's a lot, right? Who's going to do this on a daily basis outside of a few people? What are at least some key take-home thoughts about all of this? My first one is the different positivity measures, even those of today, right? So if we take the one for the cumulative, the first one that I did, the last three can lead to quite different numbers. So in this case, on today's calculations, it was 5.5%, 8.6%, and 11.0%. So again, even though I alluded to the fact that they tend to trend similarly, these are obviously just very different percentages if you're tracking those on a daily basis. You can get a good estimate of repeat tests on a given day. So again, this is something that it's nice to know. Of all of the people tested on a given day, what proportion were brand new, had never been tested? How many new people are we reaching through our testing versus people that we've tested before and are getting tested again? I think you can get a good estimate, and I think that is an important measure to track because over time, that proportion that are repeat tests has been increasing. And again, in part, that makes sense, right? The more people that we're testing on a daily basis, there's less, there's fewer new people to test on a subsequent day. So in part, this does make some sense. We can understand who is excluded from the numerator and denominator of the percent positivity for new cases. And again, this is something that I've done in previous videos, but the two main percent positivity measures that are reported by the Florida Department of Health, one is more intuitive to people. The other one we know kind of treats repeats differently. And so again, I think this is an important thing to understand, that in that percent positive for new cases, we are excluding 44.3% of the numerator and 13.2% of the denominator today. Those numbers will change on a daily basis, but by and large, that calculation is always excluding more or higher proportion from the numerator than it is from the denominator, which explains why the percent positivity for new cases is usually less than the case positivity. And last but not least, the rest of the specificity would be nice, those 6 different phenotypes of people tested, but it's probably not needed and only serves to remedies one's OCD. So again, I hope that this at least gives you some idea of where the numbers come from. Yeah, I'd love your feedback, and I'd love to know if people disagree or can get under the hood of this a little bit more. Take care. Have a great day.